Before we get started, I just want to let everybody know we started a Discord server. It's totally free, and we'll talk more about it towards the end. The link is in the description. Hey there, Chris here from Sotera Media. In this video, we're going to take a look at a few techniques of varying complexity for painting out unwanted objects or features in a shot we're working on. Paint artists do some incredible work that, if done well, goes completely unnoticed by the audience. First, we'll look at how to use a single point tracker to remove a blemish. Second, we'll use a planar track to remove an outlet from a wall. And third, we'll use the 3D camera tracker in DaVinci Resolve Studio to remove an object that overlaps multiple levels of parallax. Let's get started. So for the entirety of this tutorial, we're going to exist inside the Fusion page. So that's where I got to. This tutorial is meant for kind of seasoned beginners, so I'd expect that you know how to get to this point where we're in the Fusion page. So for our first shot, and we have our subject here, we have an extreme close-up of someone's face, and what we want to do is get rid of this freckle. You may be thinking, why are we removing someone's freckle? And to that I say, you're going to be asked to do lots of different things that might not make sense when you work in this field. So for this sort of removal, all we'll need, most likely, is a single point tracker on that freckle. So what we're going to do is we're going to paint out the freckle, we're going to track it, and by virtue of doing that, the paint strokes will continue throughout the entire clip, even when we see the subject kind of scrunch her face up a little bit. So let's get started. So first what we're going to do is we're going to add a paint node. Now we're going to have it kind of float above here because what we're going to do is actually merge our paint strokes over top of the footage rather than paint on the footage directly. It's going to give us some added flexibility, and you'll kind of want to get into the habit of doing that for the most part, unless there are specific instances where it makes more sense to paint directly on the footage. Now, the paint node will require an input, and for that, we're going to grab a background node, and we're going to attach that to the input of the paint node, and we're going to go into the background node's properties. We're going to turn the alpha all the way down. Next, we just need a merge node to merge that over top. I'm holding down Shift to attach to that. And then we'll attach that to the foreground input on the merge node. And now we're pretty well on our way. So what we'll do is select the paint node. For this sort of painting where we want it to continue across all of the frames, we're going to choose stroke, this brush here at the top. And within here, I like to open up the brush controls because we'll want to change that as we go. And for the apply mode, we're going to choose clone. Now our source tool down here will define from where we're painting. So for this, we're going to want to take media in one and drag it into that box here. So just click and drag. And now media in one is our source. Now to clone, all we need to do is hit Alt and hold it down, or should be Option on the Mac, Alt click, and that will set the clone source within our image here. So it's going to be cloning from this spot here. What we also may want to do is just soften up our brush a little bit so that it blends in nicely. And all we need to do now is set our clone source. We'll want to clone from areas of similar brightness to where we have our blemish. So we can set our clone source to here. Now, one thing that I just did that without thinking about it is if we move over this way, over this direction, we'll end up cloning from skin that's a little bit darker because this is very slightly in shadow. So we want to make sure that we're mindful of where we're cloning from, that the source is similar brightness to the skin around the blemish. So we'll clone from the top, and we should be able to just click a few times, and it's gone. Now what we want to do in order to track this, so we want to select median 1 and make that active. We'll grab our paint tool here, and we're going to switch over to our selection. We're going to click and drag to select all of the strokes that we have. We'll see them show up here. And what we'll want to do then is we want to group these together so that way we can track the entire paint out rather than just any individual stroke. So up at the top, we'll click Paint Group, and that'll create a group from our paint strokes. What we'll want to do then is we'll right click on this and go to our Paint Group 1 center, and we're going to modify with tracker position. So that's going to create a tracker for us. Now, one thing I was running into, I don't know if it's a bug, but as I was tracking, it was not showing the footage moving. It was only showing the tracker moving. We'll see how that goes. We'll see if it shows up. I was able to get it to work by closing out of DaVinci Resolve and opening it back up again. But if you don't see it, your footage moving, because it's easier that way to review what's happening to see if the track is holding tight or not. If that does happen, you can always just go back and review it afterwards and make sure that the track stays in place. It's not the most efficient way to do it, but I couldn't figure out why DaVinci Resolve was not showing me that tracking as it happened. We'll see what happens. So with our paint node here selected, we want to go into modifiers, and now we want to set our tracker source to media in 1, just like we did before. And I started on frame 0. You may start on a different frame depending on what kind of footage you're working on. But from here, I'm just going to go ahead and track forward. And now we see that it's doing it again. This is what I was talking about, where we see the tracker moving, but the footage is not moving. It seems arbitrary when it happens. I haven't been able to figure out why it's happening, but because we also see that the tracker windows here are also not updating, which in this case, it should be fine because it's a very easy track. It's a very obvious feature, and there's not a ton of movement, so it should track just fine if you're using the project files that I share. But yeah, it looks like it tracked just fine. So now, if we switch back over to our merge, when we play this back, and it even held up very well when the subject scrunches her face. Now, say if you wanted to track and remove multiple blemishes, I would recommend doing them all separately. You wouldn't want to put multiple blemishes in the same group. You want to make sure to keep those groups separate. If it were me, I would probably also do multiple instances of this node group here, just to kind of keep everything separate. That's just me. I like to have everything out in front. If I have multiple things happening within a node, I usually like to have those things happen in separate nodes instead, so I can see everything that's going on and not have anything hidden. But that is how we do a very simple single point blemish removal inside of Fusion. If you were wondering a little bit more about techniques as far as actually cloning and things like that, this video is just basically covering workflows within DaVinci Resolve. So if you were interested in learning more about how to clone better, it's the same concept as in a lot of ways as when you're using Photoshop or another program like that. I will link a good tutorial for that in the description. So for our next shot here, we're going to use the paint node paired up with a planar tracker to remove this electrical outlet here on the wall. Now the planar tracker will really shine when we have things that are on a surface that we want to remove, and there's a bit of perspective shift and things like that. It's a nice, easy way to get that paint task completed. So what we'll want to do to get started is we're going to want to find a frame where the thing we want to remove is both most in focus and that the surface that we're tracking is most visible. So here the camera turns and we see even more of the wall. So we'll probably want to use this frame here. Now to do that, next we'll grab the planar tracker and we'll put that in between media in and media out. And we'll want to set our reference time just by hitting set here. And we'll want to track this. So to do that, we do see a little bit of perspective shift happening. So we'll want to set the motion type to perspective. And what we'll do is we'll select our wall. Now we are selecting the wood here, which does fall a little bit closer to the camera, but not by enough that it'll make too much of a difference for our purposes here. Well, maybe we want to include a little bit more. You'll want to include any places where you'll want to clone from within this box here. So what we'll do first is we'll track backwards. And then we'll hit go next to our reference time, and we'll track the rest of it forward. Now we can check how we did. If we switch this operation mode here to steady, we'll make sure this is active in the viewer. Let's see how we look. I want to check to make sure that this area remains stable. And looks good. Now our paint setup is very similar. We'll grab a paint node and a background node just like before. Connect that up, make the background transparent. Want to grab a merge node, drop it down. There we go. Now we'll make the merge active in the viewer. Grab the paint. We'll make sure we switch to stroke. Open up our brush controls and switch to clone. Now for our source tool, we'll want to use the planar tracker node. Click and drag that into there. So that way we're painting off of the steadied image. And now our next step would be to clone out this receptacle. Now this tutorial is focusing more on workflows and less on paint techniques and cloning techniques. If you need more information about how to clone things out, I'll leave a link in the description to a good cloning tutorial and more information on how that works. But for now, I'll go through and paint this out, and I'll leave it in here but sped up so that way you don't have to sit through the whole thing in its entirety. But basically what we're going to do is recreate this brick texture inside of here just by cloning from different places around the receptacle, taking special care to pay attention to the direction of shadows and things like that. But if all that's kept in mind, it'll clone out just fine and nobody will ever notice. So we'll go ahead and do our best to review this. When you use the paint node, it tends to bog things down a little bit. So in order to reverse the steady operation and make our footage look correct again with our painted wall, we'll go ahead and we'll duplicate the planar tracker node and we'll click invert steady transform. So now on our media out, we'll get the footage, but with the painted wall instead. Now this will take a while to process, so what we'll do is I'm going to switch over to the timeline. I'm just going to duplicate this. And then I'm going to disable the bottom one, and we'll render this in place. So now we can take a look at it in real time. And that's looking pretty good. On an actual project, you may want to take a little bit more care and time when it comes to painting, but for these purposes, this is just showing you how to use the planar tracker with the paint node. Now for our last shot, we're going to do something a little more complex, and we're going to use the 3D camera tracker to do a paint out. Now, this will require DaVinci Resolve Studio. And the reason that we're using this method is because what we want to remove is this sign up here, this object. Now normally with the other two methods, we could track this and paint it out. But the problem is we have two levels of parallax happening here, two levels of depth. We see that the hill in the front is moving at a different speed to the hill in the background. So if we were to paint this out, we would just have a complete mess. It would not work out. We would have a paint out that was moving at the same speed as this hill in the front here, while ignoring the back, and it would stick out like a sore thumb. So what we're going to do is use the 3D camera tracker, and we're going to place two planes, one at this level of parallax and one at this level of parallax. And we're going to paint out twice. And what that's going to do is we're going to see the hill move at the right speed. We're going to paint out from here up, and then we're going to paint out from here down. And once we put it all together, you won't be able to notice any difference. Now that might sound a little bit abstract. It'll make more sense once we get into it. So let's get started on that. So to begin, what we need is our camera tracker node. And we're going to attach that right after the media in. Now, as with any 3D camera track, we do want to look for anything that's going to confuse the tracker. In this case, we don't see too much movement or anything like that. We do have some windows, but and some movement of people down here, but it should be able to filter that out pretty easily. So what we want to do is we'll click Preview Auto Track Locations. It's going to show us where points are going to show up. For the sake of ease in placing the planes, we want to make sure that we end up with a good amount of trackers here and here. So what we're going to do is maybe flood it a little bit more with points. And we're going to enable bidirectional tracking. Now for the camera settings, we do not know anything about this because this is a piece of stock footage. They did not provide any information about the drone that was used here. So we're going to allow Resolve to kind of try to figure it out on its own. Let's start with this many. This should be good. The detection threshold should be all right. And let's auto track. Cool, so that's done. We'll head over to the Solve tab. And we ended up with quite a lot of points. So what we'll do is we'll try to flesh out some of the points before we try to solve it. So we'll lower the track error. And when we see them show up yellow, that means we're selecting points. We just want to make sure that we're not selecting too many. We want to make sure that we don't say roughly, we don't want to knock out, we want to keep roughly like 60% of the tracks. It depends. If you end up deleting too many, it will let you know and you can go back and try again with this. We're just trying to make the solve a little bit faster because we often need to end up deleting some anyway to make the solve a little bit better. So once we've selected some, we'll go ahead and hit delete. And then we'll click solve. Now, depending on your system, this may take a little bit. It takes a little while to show progress, so just be patient with it. As long as it's still open, it should still be processing. Alrighty, so the solve has completed. Now, generally speaking, when we do these, we want to aim for a solve error of less than 1, and it looks like we're at 0.59, which is pretty darn good. I'd probably usually want to refine that further, but that should be just fine for our purposes. So now what we'll do is we'll export our 3D scene. Let's see where that went. Okay, that's up here. And we'll move it into view. So now, if we make our merge 3D active, we can kind of take a look at our 3D scene. I did do a little bit of alignment on it. Kind of raised it up just so that way the ground plane and everything wasn't visible. It is something you can simply remove, but I also don't like seeing the grid. Also something you can turn off, but I just chose to move things out of the way instead. Now, like I said before, how this is oriented is not as important when we're doing this. What is important is placing our geometry in the right place. So the way that we're going to do that is we'll make the camera tracker active. We'll click on it. And let's zoom into our sign in the front here. And we're just going to scrub through. We want to try to find points that are on our sign. So it looks like we have some here. So this tells us that we have some points that we can use to locate this sign in 3D space. So let's open up Merge 3D again. And we'll right click anywhere in the viewport. And we'll choose Camera, and then Camera 3D. On your end, it might be camera 3D1. Now, we're going to end up with a few more cameras as we go along. So these you'll want to label. You want to make sure that you keep these straight. This you can perhaps rename to main camera, and let's do that now. And this just refers to the camera that is actually moving through the scene rather than cameras that are projecting our patches onto the scene. Now we see there's quite a bit going on here. Let's get some playback going. We can see those same points here. So what we want to do is we're going to select these two by holding down Shift and clicking. We just want to make sure they're good, that they are on the right spot. We can see them moving along with the sign. Now what we want to do is we'll go right click and point cloud 3D2, and we'll create a aligned shape. So that will do its best job to align what is by default a cylinder to that spot. I don't like having all these extra merge 3Ds that it creates, nor do I like it going through the point cloud. So what I like to do is disconnect this, get rid of the merge 3D, and plug it directly into the scene. We'll switch this to a plane, and typically by default it's probably going to be way too small. So we'll just start by making the size a whole lot bigger. And sometimes it may help if we open up a second viewer. I'm going to make the merge 3D be over here. Actually, it's already there. Switch the camera to the main camera, and then I'm going to make this second viewer the rendered view. So we can see it a little bit easier. So right now it is not oriented correctly, and it's probably going to be just a little off. So one thing I like to do is I'm going to click on one of these points, right click, point cloud 3D2, and let's choose create locator. So I'm just going to move that down, and same thing, I wish it would not do that by default. So attach that locator, and that'll just put a little point that tells us where exactly that point is that we're trying to align to. And we'll use that in a second to make sure that it's perfectly in the right place. And then we'll also create a second locator on the point right next to it, so that way we can orient it more precisely. So what we'll do is we'll choose our shape, and we're just going to start rotating it. So it looks like our Z is up, Y is to the right. Things are a little bit out of whack. That's okay. We'll move the Y a bit, and then we'll move the X. We're going to have to reorient this so that way things are a little bit more the way they should be. I want to have that facing front. I want this to roughly be like this. And just for when we project things onto this geometry, it's just going to work out, and you'll see how that works in just a little bit. We'll also just want to make it a bit bigger than it needs to be. Alrighty, so now that we have the plane kind of in the right spot, we're going to switch this over to perspective. So I'm just right clicking in the viewport here, going to perspective. We'll just kind of zoom in. Let's check out where our locators are. So it looks like I actually did a pretty good job. Now, we don't want to take that for granted. What we want to do is kind of make sure that it's in the right spot. Now to do that, there's a cool add-on as a part of Reactor. It's just a simple checker texture that you can plug into a 3D object. And a link should pop up top to a video I have on how to install Reactor. Once you have that installed, it's just called Checker. So if you search for that in Reactor, you should find it. And we'll plug that into the material input on our shape here. And we'll go ahead and change these repeats until we're satisfied. We want it to be pretty dense, maybe 5. And that should be good. That should tell us how we're doing. So we'll start at the beginning, just play through, make sure that that is sticking to the sign. And I think at this point, we are looking at just the normal perspective shift that's going to happen as this drone pans around this building, or orbits, I should say. Now's the fun part. We're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to create our patch. Now this can be done either in Resolve or in a program like Photoshop. In this case, we're going to try to keep everything inside of Resolve, so that way there's no external tools needed. Now what we want to do is try to find a good middle point for it. I think around 68 should be good. So what we're going to do is grab a time speed node, and we're going to plug our media into the time speed. We're going to set our delay to 68 frames, which is the frame that we've chosen. Set the speed to 0. So now this will give us a completely frozen frame. Now that we have that, we're going to set up our paint nodes. So we'll go ahead and grab a background node. Oops, don't want that connected. And we'll drop the alpha down on that. And we'll bring in a paint node. Connect the background to the input on the paint node. Next, we'll bring in a merge. We'll put the paint on the foreground. And we'll connect our time speed node to the background. And then we'll go ahead and make this active. And by this, I mean the merge node. That way we can see what we're painting. Now we'll click on the paint node. Kind of come in here. And just like before, we're going to choose stroke. And then clone. And our source tool now is going to be the time speed node. Now what we're going to want to do is pay attention to how this hill curves. We're going to want to paint up to the edge of the hill. Now we may overlap in the beginning. I'm just going to paint this basic shape here. You can also kind of be a little loose with where we clone from. I'm going to make the brush a little smaller. For this demonstration, this isn't going to be quite perfect, but it'll show the technique. I want to clean up any repeats, that way it looks good. Now to help out with the next part, I'm actually going to drag in a color corrector. I'm going to put it after the paint node. Enable predefined post multiply, and just going to switch it to red. Now what we want to do is remove anything that sticks out too far. So I'm going to come into the paint node, and I'm going to grab the eraser tool. I'm just going to come in here, going to chop this off a little bit, smooth things over. And this will also help us see where the patch is and how it's moving. All right, so we've got our patch here. Now what we're going to do is set up the actual catcher. So the way this works is we're going to duplicate this camera here, our main camera. And let's rename this to something memorable, like front sign. We want to make sure we're on 68. We're going to keep all that's consistent when we're doing this. We want to keep it all on the same frame, especially when we do what we're about to do with the camera, which is we're going to take the output of the color corrector node and drop that on top of the camera. And that opens up some new options for us within the camera. So we have a projection tab here and a material tab, image. And what we're going to do first, in order to freeze that camera in place at frame 68, we're going to unlock it, go into transform, and we're going to right click on translation and say remove all from translate group. And for rotation, we're going to right click and say remove all from rotate group. What that's going to do is freeze the camera on frame 68. It's going to project frame 68, this patch here, onto our shape. And you'll see that in just a moment. It'll make sense make more sense once you see it. But we're going to go back into the camera here. We're going to go to our projection tab. And we need to enable camera projection. And we're going to change the projection mode to texture. And then under image, we're going to uncheck enable image plane, which would end up giving us a doubled up projection, and we don't want that. So now we've got our camera set up. And to kind of see this part of it visually, if we go into Merge 3D and then go to Camera Perspective, when we scrub through the timeline, we can see that camera at frame 68 just sitting there. What's going to happen is it's going to project our patch onto our geometry here. That's going to stay put, and our regular camera is going to continue to orbit. And what will happen is we should see our patch cover up the spot that we want. So let's get that going. Now, to make it so that the image is projected onto our geometry, we just need to make a change to the shape 3D. In that, we need to give it a catcher material. So a catcher material is just going to tell that shape to receive the image projected from this camera. So we'll plug that in to shape 3D1. Now we'll see it disappear, and that's normal. No problem there. But if we go in a little further, we can now see our patch. Now, since we're dealing with multiple projections, we're going to have this one and then the one on the hill behind it. Inside of the catcher, we want to choose Restrict by Projector ID. For now, we can leave this to 1. Then the next one that we do will be 2. On the camera, that projector ID is here as well. So that's how we tell it which one of those to project the patches onto. Now, all we need to do is we need to come back into the camera tracker renderer, and now we see our patch sitting there. What we'll do is we'll play backwards, and it looks like it's sticking there pretty good. Now, it's come to my attention in the process of recording this that there is a bit of a known bug with this process. We're still going to be able to pull this off, but it makes things a little bit more headache inducing. So what I'm talking about is, if we switch to perspective here, if you notice, despite us selecting our projector ID properly, we come in, let's just troubleshoot, make sure, yeah, we have projector ID 1 here, projector ID 1, and here we have projector ID 2, and projector ID 2. We are seeing a bit of an issue here. It appears that the projector ID assignment is being ignored, that we're projecting both patches onto both pieces of geometry. Now, there are a couple of possible solutions. So one potential fix that's kind of like iffy and a bit more complicated would be to create separate Merge 3D nodes with all of this stuff connected and separate renderers, and then composite them together. Since that does get a little bit more dicey, I will demonstrate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the main camera and all that, the Merge 3D there. We already have one plugged in. Half the work is already done technically. We'll paste this. So the first shape and the catcher remain, as do all of these. And then we have down here, same exact thing. We're going to even grab the renderer from here. But then we plug our rear patch into this second Merge 3D, and then that shape. Then we also, we have the camera, we have all that. We have this camera plugging into there. And we should end up rear patch, front patch. We're going to remove the background. So now we have these rendering out separately. And all we need to do then is merge. This is the background. This is the patch towards the back. That goes in the background. This into the foreground. And then we can grab our footage. Then we merge this for the foreground. And then the footage goes on the background. And now we should have it properly. Now we do need to paint a little bit more because of the change in the parallax. We need to kind of add a little bit more to our patch there, but now we see it properly. Everything looks normal in terms of it not doubling up and looking strange. Now there is another option for fixing this, and that would be if we come into the renderer. You can switch it from hardware to software renderer. It's going to be slower, but it will work. If you're trying to work quickly, you would probably want to use this setup here. And that's what we'll kind of go with for the rest of this. It'll work all the same. We're just doing things a little bit differently. This is a bug that has apparently been around since 17. I hadn't noticed it before. It must be under specific circumstances, but there's a workaround. This video it's much less about how to paint and clone and all of that, and more about how to set up the nodes and things like that. So we're going to leave this where it is. It's definitely not acceptable at this point. Can be refined further and further. I'm also going to just chop off some of this down here. Typically, when I do paint work, I use a piece of software called Silhouette by Boris FX. Or if I'm doing 3D projection paint work, it's going to be inside of Nuke. If there's any interest in seeing a video using Silhouette and Nuke to do this same exact process, so you can kind of see how it differs and if that workflow might work better for you, leave a comment below, and I'd be happy to look at doing that. It might be a much shorter video. So as things stand, let's get some playback and see how it's looking with these changes. So we're probably not going to get real-time playback on this, so just going to do a real quick and dirty way of previewing it, which is we'll make sure that the media out is connected to our composite down here. We'll just go to the edit page and we'll duplicate this. We'll disable the bottom one and we'll render this in place. All right, now that that's rendered, let's get a peek at it. We do have some issues up here. Probably just need to extend our paint a little bit further. But for the most part, we have exactly what we need. So I'm going to take a moment to fix that up, and we'll come back with the final shot. Alrighty, so we made a few small adjustments, went ahead and extended this a little bit. So we'll go ahead and show our painted areas. There that is. If you'll notice, we also have a fun little mask on this building here. Just a very quick mask, just to occlude that. Make sure that building is in front. And the result is this. And of course, this is not the kind of paint job you'd want to do. It's a very quick one, just for the purposes of showing this. And again, not a tutorial about how to paint properly, but rather how to set up the nuts and bolts. But as you can see, we have painted out the sign, and we have proper movement in the foreground and the background. Again, like I said, if you're doing this for real, you'll want to use a more advanced tracker and perhaps an even more advanced compositor that allows you to do things like creating geometry from the points that we track. So that way you can get an even more accurate surface on which to project the patches. But for a lot of things that you'll run into where this sort of 3D painting is required, Fusion should be plenty for this kind of thing. So then to review, our basic workflow is to create a camera solve of the scene. From there, we place geometry in that scene. In this case, 2 planes. We use the paint tools to create patches, which then, using 3D cameras from the scene, they project those patches onto the planes. We then mask out anything that needs to be occluded, then we're good to go. And once more, the purpose of this is anytime that we have something we need to paint out that crosses more than one level of parallax. And that's where we'll end it. Today we examined how to set up a paint project at 3 different levels of complexity: single point, planar, and 3D. If you like this video and want to see more, consider subscribing. If you'd like access to the project files, follow the link in the description to our Patreon. Support like that goes a long way to making more of these faster. As mentioned before the video, we just launched a Discord server. Come on in to talk shop, get feedback, and ask questions about the videos. The link is in the description as well. Thanks again for watching, and have an amazing day.